The kindness of endings. The land around Tiff City lay low and green in the summer and grey in the winter, the way the whole of the Ozark country lay, folded into hills that had seen more sorrow than the folks who worked them ever spoke of. Floyd and Phoebe Hagerman had made their peace with that land a long time before 1964, and they had built a life on it that most people would call good, even if it wasn't the life they'd first pictured for themselves. They'd wanted children once, the way young married people want children, but the years had gone by without any, and by the time they were old they had folded that want away like a letter never sent and did not speak of it much. For a long while, the Hagermans ran a little liquor store in town, a plain frame building near enough to the Oklahoma line that half their trade came walking or driving across the border. Oklahoma was dry in those days, and a dry state makes a wet neighbor rich, and Floyd and Phoebe were not too proud to take the profit that came of it. The store did well through the 50s, filling up on Friday evenings with men who'd crossed the state line with dust still on their boots. Then, in April of 1959, the Oklahoma governor put his name to a bill that let his own people sell their own liquor, and the crowds from across the border thinned out considerably, though they never stopped altogether. The Hagermans didn't complain. They had their house paid for, they had their health, and they had each other, and a body can live a long time on 3 things like that. Floyd was a quiet man, the kind who did his talking with his hands and his presence rather than his mouth, and in 42 years of marriage he had never once left the store before closing time. So when he told Phoebe one evening in the late summer of 1962 that he wasn't feeling well and meant to walk on home ahead of her, she felt something turn over in her that she couldn't name. She said she'd see him at home, and the bell over the door rang out behind him, same as it always did, and she stood there for a minute listening to it fade like it might tell her something if she waited long enough. It didn't tell her anything, but the days that followed did. Floyd began leaving earlier and earlier, and then there came days when he didn't leave the house at all, and Phoebe ran the store by herself while she prayed the way country people prayed, quietly and without much hope of an answer, that her husband would come back to himself. He was 64 that year, and he had always been strong, the kind of strong that doesn't announce itself, but just goes on working, and it seemed impossible to her that anything could take that strength away. She was wrong about that, as people mostly are when they pray against the plain facts of a thing. The doctor's news came the way such news generally comes, flat and final, with no room left in it for argument. Floyd had a cancer of the throat, and it had travelled on from there into the rest of him, and there wasn't much medicine could do for a man in that shape. Floyd sat through the telling of it without moving much, the way he'd sat through every hard thing life had put in front of him, and Phoebe sat beside him in that small office, wanting to cry out but keeping still instead, because that was her way and had always been her way, and a person doesn't change her way just because the world has gone and broken. The months after that were a long and slow going down. Phoebe nursed him herself, and the store stood closed for more days than it stood open, and the town understood well enough why, and didn't ask for explanations. Neighbors came by with pies and beans and quiet words, the way Ozark folks do when a family is suffering, not making a show of it but just showing up, leaving what they'd brought on the porch or the kitchen table and going on their way again. It was a kindness that asked nothing back, and Phoebe was grateful for it even in the middle of her grief, though she hardly had the strength left over to say so. By the time Christmas was coming on, Floyd hadn't the strength to leave his bed, and what words he had left came out as whispers that Phoebe had to lean close to catch. She sat in a chair pulled up beside him hour after hour and talked to him of the old days, of how they'd met, and how he'd courted her down by the river when they were young, and of the liquor store and the men who used to come across the state line laughing on a Friday night. She didn't know if he could hear her, but she talked anyway, because silence seemed to her a worse thing than talking to a man who might not answer. On Christmas morning, she picked up the telephone and called the sheriff's office. And when the dispatcher answered, she said, plain as anything, that her name was Phoebe Hageman, and that her husband Floyd was dead, and would they please send Sheriff Cotton out to the house. There was a silence on the line before the dispatcher spoke, offering his sorrow and saying he'd send a deputy and someone from the funeral home directly. Phoebe's voice caught in her throat, but she pushed the words out anyway. "No," she said. "You better send Sheriff Cotton. I killed Floyd." The dispatcher asked her to repeat herself, not quite believing what he'd heard, and she told him again, just as plain as the first time, that she'd killed her husband. Sheriff Cotton came out himself before long, with a deputy and an ambulance behind him, and a few neighbours stood along the road watching, because such a commotion hadn't been seen in that town in a long while. Cotton went in with his pistol drawn, but held low and out of sight, not wanting to frighten the woman he'd known most of his life. He found Phoebe standing in the front room, and he asked her, gentle as he could, where Floyd was, and she told him the back bedroom, and told him again that she'd killed him. Seeing she carried no weapon, the sheriff went back to look and came out again after only a minute or two, his face gone pale and quiet. He asked her to tell him what had happened, and Phoebe turned her face toward the window, toward the snow lying white and unbroken across the yard, and she told it plain. Floyd had asked her for days, in that whisper of his, to end his suffering, and she hadn't been able to bring herself to it, not at first, though that morning he'd asked if it was Christmas, and she'd told him it was, and he'd asked her for one last gift, the only gift left that either of them had to give. "Do you love me enough to let me go? Do you love me enough to say goodbye? Can you end this for me?" he asked. Phoebe knew there weren't enough words to speak, but she told him she loved him and said goodbye. Then she put the pillow over his face until his suffering was over. The sheriff didn't have words for a moment, and then he told her in a low voice that he'd have to arrest her, and she said she knew it. She spent only a handful of days in the county jail before her friends raised enough between them for her bail. The trial came in the spring, with the hills going green again, the way they always did. The jury deliberated for a little over 3 hours. It was later said that one of the jurors had remarked, "I pray that if I were in a similar situation, I would have the courage to do the exact same thing." The jury found her not guilty and let Phoebe go home to the empty house, the memories of Floyd, and the quiet that was left for her.